The April sunshine had brought promise of spring to London when the distinguished botanist, Professor Adelaide Wentworth, arrived at Baker Street, carrying soil samples in glass vials and a leather portfolio filled with photographs of barren earth, bringing with her a mystery that would prove to be one of the most scientifically perplexing and environmentally sinister cases Sherlock Holmes ever investigated. Holmes, who had been studying various agricultural poisons and their effects on plant life as part of his research into rural crimes, work that would prove remarkably relevant to our investigation, looked up with keen interest as our troubled visitor entered. Professor Wentworth was perhaps 45 years old, a woman of evident intelligence and professional distinction, but her usual academic composure was clearly shaken by the botanical impossibility she had encountered. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began with scientific precision, despite obvious distress. "I am Professor of Botany at the Royal Horticultural Society, and I have encountered something that defies all known principles of plant biology. 6 weeks ago, a prosperous estate in Surrey called Blackthorn Manor experienced a complete and sudden death of all vegetation in its formal gardens. Not gradual decline or disease-related withering, but instantaneous death of every plant, tree, and blade of grass within a precisely defined boundary. Since that initial death, nothing will grow in that soil. We've attempted to plant dozens of species, from hardy weeds to delicate orchids, and every single plant dies within hours of being placed in that ground. The soil itself appears normal in all chemical tests, yet it has become completely hostile to life. It's as if someone has cursed the earth itself, making it forever barren." Before I continue with this most unusual case, please subscribe to Detective Sherlock if you haven't already. Your support helps us bring these mysteries to life. Like this video, hit the notification bell, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let us proceed with the baffling mystery of the garden where nothing grew. Holmes leaned forward with immediate fascination, his eyes alight with the particular intensity he showed when confronted with seemingly impossible phenomena. "Professor Wentworth, you say the death was instantaneous and affected all vegetation within a defined boundary. Describe exactly what happened and how you know the timing was simultaneous." "The estate belongs to Lord Edmund Hartley, a retired diplomat who has lived at Blackthorn Manor for 15 years, Professor Wentworth explained. The gardens were his particular pride. He'd spent years developing them with rare specimens from around the world, creating one of the finest private botanical collections in England. On the morning of March 3rd, Lord Hartley awoke to find every plant in his formal gardens completely dead. Not wilting or diseased, but dead. Leaves blackened, stems withered, flowers collapsed. Even the massive oak trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to dead husks, their leaves fallen overnight, as if struck by sudden winter frost, though the temperature that night had been mild. "The boundary you mentioned, what defines it?" Holmes asked sharply. "That's one of the most perplexing aspects," Professor Wentworth replied, producing photographs from her portfolio. "The death stops at the exact edge of the formal gardens, as if cut by an invisible line. Look at these images. You can see the formal garden area completely barren, every plant dead, the soil exposed and lifeless. But immediately beyond the garden walls, vegetation remains healthy and thriving. Roses growing against the inside of the wall are dead, while ivy growing on the outside of the same wall is perfectly healthy. The precision of the boundary is absolute and inexplicable. Holmes studied the photographs intently. They showed a stark contrast. On one side of a low stone wall, complete desolation with dead plants and bare earth. On the other side, lush spring growth with healthy vegetation. The demarcation was indeed razor sharp, as if someone had drawn a line beyond which death could not pass. "What is the size of the affected area?" I asked, examining the photographs over Holmes's shoulder. "Approximately 3 acres, Professor Wentworth replied. "The formal gardens at Blackthorn Manor are extensive, laid out in the French style with geometric beds, ornamental trees, water features, and carefully planned vistas. All of it, every square foot within the garden walls, is now completely dead and refuses to support new growth." "You mentioned attempting to plant new specimens," Holmes said. "Describe those experiments and their results." "As a botanist, I was called in 3 days after the initial death to investigate what had caused this catastrophe," Professor Wentworth explained. "My first theory was some form of rapid-acting plant disease or fungal infection, but examination revealed no pathogens, no signs of disease, no indication of biological causation. The plants hadn't died from illness. They'd simply died, as if all life had been extracted from them instantaneously. I then theorized some form of chemical contamination, perhaps industrial pollutants, heavy metals, or toxins introduced into the soil. I collected extensive soil samples and had them analysed by the finest agricultural chemists in London. The results showed normal soil composition, proper pH balance, adequate nutrients, no toxic metals, no chemical anomalies that would explain the death of vegetation. Baffled by these findings, I decided to conduct growth experiments. I brought various plant species, both hardy and delicate, plants known to tolerate poor conditions, and plants requiring optimal circumstances, and attempted to establish them in the dead garden. In every case, the result was the same. Within hours of being planted, the specimens would wither and die. I tried container-grown plants, kept in their original soil, but placed within the garden boundary. Even these would die if left there for more than a day, as if the very atmosphere within the garden was hostile to plant life. Most disturbing, Professor Wentworth continued, her voice dropping. I brought plants in sealed glass cases, completely isolated from the garden soil and air. Even these exhibited signs of stress and deterioration when placed within the garden boundary, though they would recover if removed quickly enough. It's as if there's some invisible force within that space, actively antagonistic to living vegetation. Holmes set down the photographs and picked up the soil sample vials, examining their contents closely. These samples were collected from various locations within the dead garden. Yes, from different depths and different areas. All show identical characteristics. Normal soil composition by every chemical and biological test. yet completely unable to support plant growth. Mr. Holmes, in 30 years of botanical study, I have never encountered anything like this. It violates fundamental principles of plant biology and soil science. Something has happened to this garden that science cannot explain. I don't believe in curses or supernatural forces, Holmes said firmly. There is a rational explanation, even if it's not immediately apparent. Dr. Watson and I will visit Blackthorn Manor and examine this dead garden ourselves. In the meantime, I need you to provide me with complete records of all chemical analyses performed on the soil. Detailed maps of the estate showing the exact boundaries of the affected area, and any information about events at Blackthorn Manor in the weeks before the vegetation died. Also, I'll need a list of everyone with access to the gardens: estate staff, visiting botanists, contractors, anyone who might have had opportunity to introduce some unknown agent into the soil. Over the following days, Holmes conducted extensive research into various substances that could kill vegetation rapidly and prevent regrowth. He consulted chemistry texts, agricultural references, and his own extensive files on poisons and toxins. He was particularly interested in historical accounts of land being rendered barren, salting the earth in ancient warfare, industrial contamination from manufacturing, and modern chemical accidents. The Romans would salt the earth of conquered cities to ensure nothing would grow there again, Holmes explained as he worked through his research. But salt would be easily detectable in chemical analysis, and Professor Wentworth's tests showed no such contamination. Modern industrial processes can create toxic waste that renders land barren, but again, such contamination leaves chemical signatures that would be identified in soil testing. We're looking for something that kills vegetation and prevents regrowth, but doesn't leave obvious chemical traces. Could it be radiation? I suggested, thinking of recent scientific discoveries about radioactive materials. An intriguing possibility, Holmes acknowledged. Radiation can certainly kill living things and might not be detected by standard chemical analysis. But would radiation be so precisely limited to exactly the garden boundary? And how would someone introduce sufficient radioactive material to affect 3 acres without leaving detectable residue? Still, it's worth investigating. We travelled to Surrey 2 days after Professor Wentworth's visit. Blackthorn Manor proved to be a substantial estate, a Georgian manor house surrounded by extensive grounds. As our carriage approached, the effect Professor Wentworth had described became immediately and disturbingly visible. The formal gardens, which should have been displaying spring blooms and fresh growth, were instead a landscape of death. Bare earth, withered stems, blackened leaves scattered on the ground, dead trees standing like dark skeletons against the sky. Lord Edmund Hartley received us in his study, a room lined with books and filled with artifacts from his diplomatic career. He was perhaps 60 years old, distinguished in appearance, but clearly devastated by what had happened to his beloved gardens. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am desperate for answers, Lord Hartley said, his voice heavy with emotion. Those gardens were my life's work, 15 years of careful cultivation and planning. I brought specimens from around the world, roses from China, lilies from Japan, rare orchids from South America. Every plant selected carefully, placed precisely, nurtured devotedly. And now, all of it gone, dead overnight, as if some malevolent force reached down and extracted all life from the ground. Lord Hartley, I need you to recount exactly what happened on the night of March 2nd and the morning of March 3rd, when you discovered the death, Holmes requested. Every detail, no matter how trivial it might seem. March 2nd was an ordinary day, Lord Hartley recalled. I walked through the gardens in the late afternoon, as I do almost every day when weather permits. Everything was as it should be. Early spring growth beginning, bulbs emerging, trees budding, the first flowers opening. The garden was beautiful, full of promise for the coming season. I went to bed that evening around 11 o'clock, having noticed nothing unusual. I woke early on March 3rd, around 6 o'clock, and immediately felt something was wrong, though I couldn't initially identify what disturbed me. It was the silence, I realized. No birdsong, no sound of insects, none of the subtle noises that a living garden produces. I went to the window overlooking the formal gardens and saw immediately that something terrible had occurred. The gardens were dead, completely and absolutely dead, as if winter had struck overnight, though the temperature had been mild. I dressed hurriedly and went outside to investigate. The devastation was total. Every plant, every tree, every blade of grass within the garden walls was dead. The roses I had been admiring just hours before were blackened husks. The oak trees that had stood for centuries had dropped all their leaves and stood skeletal. Even the moss on the stone paths was dead and dry. It was like walking through a landscape of ash, all life extinguished. Did you notice any unusual smells, sounds, or visual phenomena during the night, or upon discovering the death? Holmes asked. No unusual sounds during the night. I'm a light sleeper and would have noticed any disturbance. As for smell, when I first entered the dead garden that morning, there was an odd scent, slightly bitter, almost chemical, though not strongly unpleasant. I assumed it was the smell of dead vegetation. The scent faded over the following days and is now barely noticeable. Was anyone else present at the manor that night? Family, guests, staff? My wife was in London visiting our daughter. The household staff were in their quarters in the manor's east wing. My head gardener, William Thompson, lives in the cottage at the edge of the estate. So yes, there were people present, but all in locations separate from the gardens. No one reported seeing or hearing anything unusual during the night. I'd like to interview your staff and your head gardener, Holmes said, and I need to examine the gardens themselves thoroughly, take additional soil samples and investigate the precise boundary where the death stops so abruptly. Holmes spent the remainder of that day conducting a meticulous examination of the dead gardens. I accompanied him, watching as he worked with his characteristic thoroughness, examining the soil with a magnifying glass, collecting samples from various depths and locations, studying the dead plants to determine the nature of their death, measuring the precise boundaries of the affected area. The garden layout was indeed impressive, even in its current dead state. Geometric beds arranged in formal patterns, gravel paths creating clear sight lines, a central fountain now dry and surrounded by dead ornamental plants, and magnificent old trees that must have been the estate's pride, now standing skeletal and barren. "Notice the precision of the boundary, Watson," Holmes said, gesturing to the garden wall. "Here, on the inside of the wall, this climbing rose is completely dead. Blackened leaves, desiccated stems, roots withered in the soil. But here, on the outside of the same wall, merely 2 feet away, this identical rose species is healthy and thriving, showing normal spring growth. The demarcation couldn't be sharper if someone had drawn a line with a ruler." I examined both plants, astonished by the contrast. It's as if the wall provides some form of barrier protecting plants on the outside from whatever killed plants on the inside. Or as if whatever killed the interior plants was precisely applied only within the garden boundaries, Holmes countered. This degree of precision suggests deliberate human action rather than natural phenomenon or accidental contamination. Holmes also examined the dead trees carefully, cutting into their trunks with a knife to study the wood beneath the bark. The death penetrated completely through the living tissue, he observed. Not just surface damage, but cellular death throughout the entire plant. This isn't freeze damage or disease. It's as if every cell was simultaneously killed by some agent that penetrated instantaneously through the entire plant structure. We interviewed the household staff, but they provided little useful information. None had seen or heard anything unusual on the night of March 2nd. The servants' quarters were on the opposite side of the manor from the gardens, and all had been asleep during the critical hours. One housemaid mentioned that she had noticed an odd smell when she opened the windows on the morning of March 3rd, bitter and slightly sharp, but she had assumed it was related to early morning mist or some natural phenomenon. William Thompson, the head gardener, was more informative and clearly devastated by the destruction of gardens he had maintained for 12 years. "I've never seen anything like it, Mr. Holmes," Thompson said, his weathered face troubled. "I've been a gardener for 40 years, worked on estates throughout England, dealt with every kind of plant disease, pest infestation, and weather damage imaginable. But I've never seen plants die like this. All at once, completely, with no warning and no apparent cause." "Were there any unusual activities in or around the gardens in the days or weeks before the death?" Holmes asked. "Deliveries, contractors, visitors, any changes to routine?" Thompson considered carefully. "There was a delivery about 2 weeks before the death, a shipment of fertilizer and soil amendments that Lord Hartley had ordered from a supplier in London. The delivery was made to the potting shed, and I'd been using the materials in my normal maintenance work. But I've used products from that same supplier for years without any problems." "I'd like to examine that fertilizer," Holmes said immediately. Thompson led us to the potting shed, a well-organized workspace at the edge of the gardens. Inside were the typical implements of serious gardening: tools, pots, labels, and several large sacks of fertilizer and soil amendments. Holmes examined each sack carefully, opening them to inspect the contents, smelling the materials, even tasting tiny samples to test their chemical characteristics. "This fertilizer appears normal," Holmes concluded after thorough examination. "Standard composition, no unusual adulterants or contaminants. I'll take samples for chemical analysis, but I don't believe this is the source of the problem." "Was there anything else unusual in the weeks before March 3rd? I asked Thompson. "Anyone asking unusual questions about the gardens? Any strangers observed near the estate? Any incidents that seemed odd at the time?" "There was one thing, now that you mention it," Thompson said slowly. "About 3 weeks ago, I encountered a man walking through the gardens early one morning. He claimed to be a botanist, interested in Lord Hartley's collection. Said he'd heard about the rare specimens and wanted to see them. I told him he needed to get permission from Lord Hartley before visiting, but the man said he just wanted a quick look and would come back properly later. He left without incident, and I didn't think much of it at the time." "Can you describe this man?" Holmes asked sharply. "Perhaps 40 years old, tall and thin, well dressed, like a gentleman or professional person. He carried a leather satchel and appeared knowledgeable about plants, used proper botanical names when commenting on the specimens. He had a notebook and was making sketches or taking notes, though he put it away quickly when I approached him." "Did he give a name?" "He introduced himself as Dr. Maxwell, but I don't know if that was his real name. He had a slightly foreign accent, European but not strongly so, as if he'd lived in England for many years." Holmes's interest was clearly piqued. "Did this Dr. Maxwell touch any of the plants or soil during his visit?" "I didn't observe him touching anything," Thompson replied. "He was just walking through the gardens and observing. But I wasn't watching him the entire time. I encountered him near the rose beds and spoke with him for perhaps 5 minutes before he left through the main gate." "And you haven't seen him since?" "No, he never returned to request proper permission to visit, which I thought was odd. Someone genuinely interested in rare botanical specimens would typically follow up to arrange a formal viewing." Holmes made extensive notes about this encounter. "This mysterious Dr. Maxwell visited 3 weeks before the garden death was, observed making notes or sketches, carried a satchel that could have contained materials for contaminating the soil, and showed knowledge of botany. He bears investigation." We returned to the dead gardens for further examination. Holmes was particularly interested in the garden's water supply, a system of underground irrigation pipes fed by a well located within the estate grounds. If someone wanted to introduce a toxic agent that would affect the entire garden simultaneously, the irrigation system would be an ideal delivery mechanism, Holmes reasoned. Contaminate the water supply, and every plant watered with that contaminated water would be exposed to the toxin. We examined the well and the mechanical pumping system that distributed water through the irrigation network. Holmes took water samples from various points in the system, carefully labeling each one for later analysis. The well room also contained records of pumping operations, showing when the irrigation system had been activated. According to these records, Holmes noted, studying the logbook, the gardens were irrigated on the evening of March 2nd, beginning at 7 p.m. and running for approximately 3 hours. That would have been the last time water was applied, before the morning of March 3rd, when the death was discovered. So if the water was contaminated, that final irrigation could have delivered the killing agent to all the plants simultaneously, I observed. Precisely, Holmes agreed, and the irrigation system would explain the sharp boundary pipes only served the formal gardens within the walls, not the surrounding areas. Plants outside the gardens wouldn't have been exposed to contaminated water from the irrigation system. Holmes's investigation expanded to include research into Lord Hartley's background, business dealings, and potential enemies. Lord Hartley had enjoyed a distinguished diplomatic career, serving in embassies across Europe and Asia, negotiating treaties and representing British interests in sensitive political situations. Such a career inevitably created both admirers and adversaries. Did you make enemies during your diplomatic service? Holmes asked Lord Hartley during a subsequent interview. Anyone who might seek revenge through destroying something you clearly love, your gardens? Diplomatic work inevitably creates tensions, Lord Hartley admitted. I negotiated treaties that disadvantaged some parties while favouring others. I represented British interests in disputes where other nations felt aggrieved. But most diplomatic conflicts are resolved through official channels, not through personal vendettas. I can't think of anyone who would harbour such resentment that they would seek revenge 15 years after my retirement. What about commercial rivals or personal disputes unrelated to your diplomatic career? Holmes pressed. I've lived quietly in retirement, Mr. Holmes. I don't engage in business beyond managing my own investments. I have no commercial rivals, no personal enemies that I'm aware of. The gardens were my passion in retirement, a way to create beauty and preserve rare botanical specimens. Who would want to destroy that? Someone who knew how much the gardens meant to you, Holmes replied grimly. Someone who wanted to hurt you profoundly by destroying something irreplaceable. The precision and totality of this attack suggests personal hatred, not random vandalism or accidental contamination. Holmes also investigated Professor Adelaide Wentworth's background and connections to Lord Hartley, though he was careful to approach this inquiry diplomatically. Professor, how did you come to be consulted about the garden death? What is your relationship with Lord Hartley? I've known Lord Hartley socially for several years through the Royal Horticultural Society, Professor Wentworth explained. He would occasionally seek my advice about particular specimens he was considering for his collection, and I'd visited Blackthorn Manor several times to see his gardens. When the death occurred, he contacted me immediately because he knew I had expertise in plant diseases and unusual botanical phenomena. I was as shocked as he was by what I found. Have you encountered anything similar in your previous botanical work? Holmes inquired. Never, Professor Wentworth said firmly. I've investigated unusual plant deaths, disease outbreaks, and various botanical mysteries over my career, but I've never seen anything approaching this level of rapid, total death with no regrowth capability. It's unprecedented in my experience. Holmes spent several days analysing the soil and water samples he had collected, using both his own chemical knowledge and consulting with specialists at London universities. The results were frustrating. All tests continued to show normal composition with no identifiable toxins or contaminants. Whatever killed these plants either breaks down rapidly, leaving no chemical trace, or operates through a mechanism we're not testing for, Holmes concluded. We need to think beyond conventional poisons and toxins. He began researching more exotic possibilities, various industrial chemicals, experimental agricultural products, even biological weapons being developed by various nations' military research programs. His inquiries led him to a disturbing discovery about a little-known class of chemicals called persistent organic pollutants that could remain in soil for extended periods and prevent plant growth even in minute concentrations. There's a particular compound, Holmes explained, after days of intensive research, developed originally for industrial use, but found to have devastating effects on plant life. It's called hexachlorobenzene, a chlorinated hydrocarbon that binds to soil particles and prevents plant roots from absorbing water and nutrients. Even tiny amounts can render soil completely sterile for months or years. But wouldn't such a compound show up in chemical analysis? I asked. Not in standard soil tests, Holmes replied. It requires specialized analytical techniques to detect, and most agricultural chemists wouldn't think to test for it because it's primarily an industrial chemical, not an agricultural poison. I need to arrange for specific testing of the blackthorn soil samples using techniques that can identify chlorinated hydrocarbons. Holmes contacted a chemist at Imperial College who specialized in industrial pollutants and arranged for the soil samples to be tested for hexachlorobenzene and related compounds. The results, received 3 days later, confirmed Holmes's theory. The soil from the dead gardens contained elevated levels of hexachlorobenzene, sufficient to completely prevent plant growth, and explaining why all attempts at replanting had failed. "This is murder of a garden," Holmes declared, showing me the test results. Someone deliberately introduced substantial quantities of this industrial poison into the irrigation system, knowing it would be distributed throughout the gardens and kill all vegetation. The chemical binds to the soil and remains active for extended periods, preventing any regrowth. It's sophisticated, deliberate, and required knowledge of industrial chemistry and garden irrigation systems. The question now became, who had both the knowledge and the opportunity to contaminate the irrigation system? Holmes focused his investigation on the mysterious Dr. Maxwell, who had been observed in the gardens 3 weeks before the death occurred. Using his extensive network of contacts, Holmes began inquiring about European chemists or botanists matching Thompson's description who might have expertise with industrial chemicals. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former colleague of Lord Hartley's from his diplomatic days contacted Holmes after learning about the investigation. "I heard you were inquiring about a European scientist named Maxwell," the former diplomat wrote. "There is a chemist named Dr. Heinrich Maximilian who worked for the German chemical industry until approximately 5 years ago. He was dismissed from his position under controversial circumstances. Accusations of industrial sabotage, though nothing was ever proven. He was known to harbour resentment against Britain due to a diplomatic incident during Lord Hartley's time as ambassador to Berlin. Holmes immediately pursued this lead, discovering that Dr. Heinrich Maximilian had indeed relocated to London 3 years ago, working as a freelance industrial consultant under the anglicised name Dr. Henry Maxwell. His expertise included chlorinated hydrocarbons and industrial pollutants, exactly the knowledge required to select and deploy hexachlorobenzene as a garden poison. Further investigation revealed the connection to Lord Hartley. 15 years earlier, during sensitive diplomatic negotiations in Berlin, Lord Hartley had been involved in a trade dispute that resulted in significant financial losses for the German chemical company employing Maximilian. The chemist had publicly blamed British diplomatic interference for the company's difficulties and for his subsequent career problems when the company began downsizing. Maximilian harbored a grudge for 15 years, Holmes explained, as the pieces came together. When he relocated to London and learned that Lord Hartley, now retired and living quietly, had created these magnificent gardens that were his pride and joy, Maximilian saw an opportunity for perfect revenge. Not physical harm to Lord Hartley himself, but destruction of something irreplaceable that Hartley loved deeply. It's psychological rather than physical violence, but no less devastating for its target. Holmes located Maximilian's residence and place of business in London, a small chemical consulting office in an industrial district. With Inspector Lestrade accompanying us, Holmes confronted the chemist with the evidence of his crime. Dr. Heinrich Maximilian was indeed the man Thompson had described. Tall, thin, with the bearing of an educated professional, but with cold eyes that suggested deep resentment. When presented with the evidence, his visit to Blackthorn Manor, his expertise with hexachlorobenzene, his known grudge against Lord Hartley, and the chemical analysis proving the poison in the soil, Maximilian's composure cracked. "Lord Hartley destroyed my career," Maximilian said bitterly. "His diplomatic maneuvering cost my company millions of marks, led to layoffs, including my own dismissal, ruined my reputation in German industrial circles. I spent years rebuilding my life in England, always knowing that the man responsible lived in comfortable retirement, untouched by the consequences of his actions. When I learned about his precious gardens, the botanical treasures he had spent years collecting, I saw justice. Not legal justice, but poetic justice. I would destroy what he loved most, as he had destroyed my career and prospects." "So you visited Blackthorn Manor under false pretenses," Holmes said. "Surveyed the gardens and irrigation system, then returned later, probably during the night of March 2nd, to introduce hexachlorobenzene into the water supply. You knew the chemical would be distributed throughout the gardens by the irrigation system that evening, killing all vegetation simultaneously and binding to the soil to prevent regrowth. You calculated the psychological impact on Lord Hartley, waking to find his life's botanical work destroyed overnight, unable to understand how or why, watching as all attempts at restoration failed because the soil itself had been poisoned. It was elegant revenge," Maximilian said with bitter satisfaction. "More painful than physical violence, more permanent than simple vandalism. Those gardens can never be restored, not without removing and replacing all the contaminated soil, which would take years and cost a fortune. Lord Hartley will live with the knowledge that his botanical legacy is permanently destroyed, just as I have lived with the destruction of my career." "Your revenge was indeed elegant," Holmes replied coldly, "but also criminal. You trespassed on Lord Hartley's property, deliberately destroyed valuable vegetation, caused substantial financial harm, and employed a dangerous industrial chemical in a manner that could have threatened human health if anyone had been exposed to concentrated doses. You will face prosecution for these crimes." Dr. Maximilian was arrested and charged with criminal trespass, deliberate destruction of property, and unlawful use of hazardous chemicals. The trial attracted substantial attention from both the legal community and the scientific world. The prosecution presented Holmes's investigation as evidence, including the chemical analysis proving hexachlorobenzene contamination, witness testimony placing Maximilian Blackthorn Manor, and documentation of his expertise with the specific poison used and his documented grudge against Lord Hartley. The defense attempted to argue that destroying plants, however valuable, was mere property damage, not deserving severe punishment. But the prosecution countered that the calculated, premeditated nature of the crime, combined with Maximilian's use of dangerous industrial chemicals and the permanent destruction of irreplaceable botanical specimens, warranted serious consequences. The jury convicted Maximilian on all charges. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, noted the particularly malicious nature of the crime. He did not act from passion or immediate anger, but from cold calculation and years of nursing resentment. He struck at Lord Hartley through destruction of living things he had nurtured for years, causing psychological harm as severe as physical injury. Your scientific knowledge, which should be used for human benefit, was corrupted into a tool of vengeance. This court sentences you to 5 years imprisonment and orders you to pay restitution to Lord Hartley for the value of the destroyed gardens, though no amount of money can truly compensate for what you have taken from him. For Lord Hartley, the resolution brought both satisfaction and sadness. The criminal had been caught and punished, but the gardens remained dead, the soil poisoned for years to come. At least I know now that the destruction was deliberate malice, not some failure on my part or mysterious curse, Lord Hartley told us after the trial. There's cold comfort in understanding, but it's better than remaining forever baffled by inexplicable catastrophe. Can the gardens be restored? I asked. Eventually, yes, Professor Wentworth explained, having been consulted on remediation options. The contaminated soil must be excavated and removed, all 3 acres to a depth of at least 3 feet. New clean soil must be brought in to replace it. The process will take months and cost thousands of pounds. But once the poisoned earth is removed, the gardens can be replanted and will thrive again. The botanical collection Lord Hartley built cannot be fully replaced. Many specimens were rare or unique, but new gardens can be created. Lord Hartley decided to undertake the remediation, viewing it as an opportunity to create something new, rather than merely trying to restore what was lost. I spent 15 years building those gardens, he said with determined optimism. I can spend the remaining years of my life building new ones. Different, perhaps, but no less beautiful. Maximilian destroyed my gardens, but he didn't destroy my love of growing things, or my determination to create beauty from barren earth. The remediation work began that summer. The contaminated soil was carefully excavated under the supervision of environmental specialists, transported away for proper disposal, and replaced with clean soil brought in from uncontaminated sources. The irrigation system was thoroughly cleaned and tested to ensure no traces of hexachlorobenzene remained. By autumn, Blackthorn Manor was ready for replanting. Lord Hartley approached the new gardens not as an attempt to recreate what was lost, but as an opportunity to create something entirely different. Where the original gardens had been formal and geometric, the new design incorporated more natural, flowing shapes. Where the original collection had focused on rare specimens from around the world, the new planting emphasized native British species and plants that would support local wildlife. It was a transformation born from tragedy, but ultimately resulting in something arguably more meaningful than what had been destroyed. The old gardens were about possession and display, Lord Hartley explained as he planned the new designs with Professor Wentworth's assistance. Collecting rare specimens, showing them to visitors, taking pride in ownership of botanical treasure.
The new gardens will be about stewardship and ecology, creating habitats, supporting biodiversity, working with nature rather than trying to dominate it. In a strange way, Maximilian's cruel act has given me the opportunity to evolve beyond the collector mentality I had developed. Professor Wentworth helped Lord Hartley select species for the new gardens, emphasizing plants that would attract pollinators, provide food and shelter for birds and beneficial insects, and create a self-sustaining ecosystem rather than requiring constant human intervention. We're designing gardens that will thrive through ecological balance rather than intensive maintenance, she explained. It's a more modern approach to horticulture, recognizing that the best gardens work with natural processes rather than constantly fighting against them. The case of the garden where nothing grew entered my notes as one of Holmes's most scientifically complex investigations. It required expertise in botany, chemistry, environmental science, and psychology to understand both the mechanism of the garden's death and the motivation behind such an unusual crime. Most crimes are simple, Holmes reflected after the case concluded. Theft, violence, passion-driven murders, straightforward motives executed through obvious means. But this crime was sophisticated on multiple levels. A revenge plot that struck at psychological rather than physical targets. Execution that required advanced knowledge of industrial chemistry and plant biology. And a result that initially appeared impossible or supernatural until properly analyzed. It demonstrates how modern science creates new opportunities for both benefit and harm. The same chemical knowledge that enables industrial progress can be corrupted into a tool for malicious destruction. The case also demonstrated the importance of specialized knowledge in modern detective work. Without Professor Wentworth's botanical expertise, we might have dismissed this as a natural phenomenon, or remained forever baffled by the inexplicable garden death, Holmes acknowledged. Without advanced chemical testing for industrial pollutants, we would never have identified hexachlorobenzene as the killing agent. Without understanding of European diplomatic history and German industrial chemistry, we might never have identified Maximilian as the perpetrator. Complex crimes require complex investigations, drawing on diverse areas of expertise. The case influenced subsequent environmental regulations regarding the use and disposal of industrial chemicals. The ease with which Maximilian had obtained hexachlorobenzene and used it for malicious purposes without immediate detection highlighted gaps in chemical control policies. New regulations were enacted requiring registration of purchases of certain hazardous industrial chemicals and restricting access to compounds that could be easily weaponized against agriculture or ecosystems. The Royal Horticultural Society, prompted by Professor Wentworth, also developed protocols for investigating unusual plant deaths and systematically testing for uncommon toxins that wouldn't be identified by standard analysis. The Blackthorn case taught us that botanical mysteries may have chemical explanations that require specialized testing to identify, Professor Wentworth wrote in a paper on the case. When plants die inexplicably and soil appears normal by standard tests, we must consider industrial pollutants, experimental chemicals, and other non-traditional contaminants that require advanced analytical techniques to detect. Years after the case, I visited Blackthorn Manor to see the restored gardens. The transformation was remarkable. Where once had been formal geometric beds and rare specimens from around the world, now flourished a naturalistic landscape of native wildflowers, flowering shrubs arranged in informal groupings, and meadow areas alive with butterflies and bees. The dead, skeletal trees had been replaced by younger specimens that would grow over decades to provide shade and structure. Lord Hartley, now in his 70s, showed me around with evident pride. "These gardens are different from what I created before," he said, "but I believe they're better. The old gardens were about me, my knowledge, my taste, my ability to acquire rare plants from distant lands. These new gardens are about the plants themselves and the ecosystems they support. I'm not collecting specimens anymore. I'm cultivating habitats. It's more satisfying than I expected." We walked to a wildflower meadow where dozens of butterfly species fluttered among the blooms. "This meadow contains more life, more insects, more birds, more ecological complexity than my entire 3 acres of formal gardens ever did," Lord Hartley observed. "The formal gardens were beautiful, but ecologically sterile. These gardens are alive in a way the others never were." "Do you still feel anger toward Maximilian for destroying your original gardens?" I asked. "I did initially," Lord Hartley admitted. "The rage and grief were profound. 15 years of work destroyed in a single night. Irreplaceable specimens lost forever. But time and this new project have given me perspective. Maximilian thought he was destroying something irreplaceable, inflicting permanent psychological damage through botanical murder. But what he actually did was force me to let go of an increasingly unsustainable approach to gardening, the collecting and displaying of rarities, and embrace something more meaningful and sustainable. I don't forgive him for his malice or his crime, but I've come to see that his destructive act inadvertently created opportunity for growth and transformation." "That's a remarkably generous perspective," I observed. "It's survival," Lord Hartley said simply. "I could have remained bitter and broken, mourning the lost gardens forever. Instead, I chose to build something new. The choice to move forward rather than dwelling in bitterness is the final revenge against Maximilian, refusing to let his malice permanently diminish my life or joy." Professor Wentworth, who continued to advise on the new gardens, shared similar reflections when I spoke with her during my visit. "The Blackthorn case taught me important lessons about both botany and human nature," she said. "Botanically, I learned that gardens are more resilient than we think, not individual specimens, but the concept of gardening itself, the human impulse to cultivate beauty and nurture growing things. Maximilian killed Lord Hartley's plants, but he couldn't kill the impulse that created those gardens in the first place." As for human nature, Professor Wentworth continued, the case illustrated both its worst and best aspects. Maximilian demonstrated how intelligence can be corrupted by resentment, how knowledge can become a weapon, how nursing old grievances can poison the soul as surely as hexachlorobenzene poisoned the soil. But Lord Hartley demonstrated resilience, adaptability, the capacity to transform tragedy into opportunity for growth. Those contrasting responses to adversity, one person destroyed by bitterness, another strengthened through choosing renewal, defined the ultimate outcome of the case. Holmes maintained professional interest in the case's aftermath, particularly regarding environmental remediation and chemical contamination detection. He published a monograph on industrial poisons in agricultural contexts,
detection and remediation that drew heavily on the Blackthorn investigation. The work became a reference for environmental scientists and law enforcement officials dealing with deliberate chemical contamination of soil or water. The Blackthorn case represents a new category of crime, Holmes wrote in the monograph. We might call it environmental sabotage, the deliberate use of chemical or biological agents to destroy ecosystems, agricultural productivity, or natural beauty. Such crimes require scientific expertise to commit effectively, and scientific expertise to detect and solve. As human knowledge of chemistry and biology advances, the potential for both beneficial application and malicious misuse increases. Society must develop appropriate safeguards, detection methods, and responses to environmental sabotage, or we risk seeing more cases where scientific knowledge is weaponized against the natural world. The case also had lasting impact on Lord Hartley's former diplomatic colleagues and the international community's understanding of how old resentments can manifest in unexpected ways. The British Foreign Office conducted a review of diplomatic disputes from Lord Hartley's era, identifying other individuals who might harbour similar long-term grudges, and considering whether additional cases of delayed revenge might exist. Maximilian nursed his resentment for 15 years before acting on it, a Foreign Office memorandum noted. This raises troubling questions about how many other individuals might be harbouring similar delayed rage, waiting for opportunity to exact revenge for perceived wrongs. We must develop better systems for identifying and monitoring individuals who have been adversely affected by diplomatic actions and who might pose long-term security threats. For the local community around Blackthorn Manor, the case became something of a legend. The garden that died overnight, the mysterious poison that left no trace, the brilliant detective who solved the seemingly impossible mystery. The restored gardens became a popular destination for visitors interested in both the crime story and the innovative ecological approach Lord Hartley had adopted in his replanting. William Thompson, the head gardener who had witnessed the original destruction and participated in the restoration, became an evangelist for the new naturalistic approach. I spent 12 years maintaining those formal gardens, constant work keeping everything precisely controlled, fighting against natural processes, using chemicals to eliminate pests and weeds, Thompson told me during my visit. The new gardens require less intensive maintenance, but produce more life and beauty. It's a better way to garden, and I wish we'd discovered it without having to lose the original gardens first. The case remained memorable for me because it illustrated how crimes could target not just people, but the things people love, and how such targeting could be as psychologically devastating as physical violence. Maximilian had understood that destroying Lord Hartley's gardens would cause profound suffering, and he had been correct. The calculated cruelty of the crime, waiting 15 years to exact revenge, selecting a method that would cause maximum psychological impact, timing the attack to create maximum devastation, revealed a chilling capacity for long-term malice. Yet the case also demonstrated human resilience and the capacity for transformation in the face of tragedy. Lord Hartley could have been permanently broken by the destruction of his gardens, could have remained forever bitter about the loss, could have given up on gardening entirely. Instead, he chose to create something new, to learn from the experience, to find meaning in transformation. That choice to respond to destruction with creation
to meet malice with renewal, represented a triumph over Maximilian's cruel intentions. The garden where nothing grew has become a garden where everything grows, Holmes observed during a final visit to Blackthorn Manor, several years after the case. We stood in the wildflower meadow, surrounded by the buzzing of insects and the calls of birds attracted to the habitat Lord Hartley had created. Maximilian intended to create permanent barrenness, to ensure that Lord Hartley's land would remain forever dead. Instead, his crime catalyzed transformation that resulted in richer, more sustainable life than existed before. Its poetic justice, the destroyer defeated not through punishment, but through his victim's refusal to remain destroyed. I agreed, watching a butterfly land on a native wildflower that had self-seeded in the meadow. The original gardens were beautiful but static, carefully controlled, artificially maintained, dependent on constant human intervention. These new gardens are dynamic, self-sustaining, genuinely alive. If someone had suggested to Lord Hartley 5 years ago that he abandon his formal gardens for wildflower meadows and native plantings, he would have rejected the idea as absurd. It took catastrophic loss to open his mind to a better approach. That's often how growth occurs, Holmes replied philosophically. Not through gradual improvement of existing approaches, but through catastrophic disruption that forces fundamental rethinking. Maximilian thought he was ending Lord Hartley's gardening legacy. Actually, he was ending one phase and inadvertently forcing the beginning of something better. The garden where nothing grew taught lessons about resilience, transformation, and the relationship between destruction and creation that will endure long after the crime itself is forgotten. The case entered criminology literature as an example of revenge crimes with extended planning periods and symbolic rather than physical targets. Criminal psychology textbooks analysed Maximilian's 15-year period between perceived injury and revenge action, discussing how grudges can be nurtured over long periods and how delayed revenge can be more calculated and devastating than immediate retaliation. Maximilian represents a particular type of criminal, the long-term grudge holder who waits patiently for opportunity to exact revenge. One criminology text noted, "Such criminals are particularly dangerous because their extended planning period allows for sophisticated crimes that show none of the impulsiveness or obvious motive of crimes committed in passion. Detecting and preventing such delayed revenge requires understanding that diplomatic conflicts, business disputes, or professional disagreements can create resentments that persist for decades, and that individuals harboring such resentments may eventually translate them into criminal action when circumstances allow." Environmental science courses also used the Blackthorn case as a teaching example, illustrating how industrial chemicals could be weaponized against ecosystems, how contamination could be difficult to detect without specialized testing, and how remediation required careful planning and execution. Students studying environmental forensics learned about hexachlorobenzene's properties, detection methods, and the investigative techniques Holmes had used to identify it as the killing agent. The Blackthorn case demonstrates the importance of thinking beyond obvious explanations when investigating environmental problems. Science textbooks noted, "When plants die inexplicably and standard tests show nothing wrong with soil or water,
environmental investigators must consider uncommon contaminants, industrial pollutants, and deliberate sabotage rather than assuming natural causes. The systematic approach Holmes employed, gathering extensive samples, consulting specialists, testing for non-standard contaminants, investigating human motives alongside environmental factors, should be the model for all serious environmental investigations. For Sherlock Holmes, the case represented a successful application of his investigative methods to a problem that initially seemed beyond detective work's scope. When Professor Wentworth first consulted me, I wondered if this was truly a case for a detective, or whether it was a purely scientific mystery requiring only botanical and chemical expertise, Holmes reflected. But the investigation proved that the most important element was recognizing that the garden death was a crime rather than a natural phenomenon. Once that framework was established, that someone had deliberately killed the gardens, detective methods became applicable, identifying suspects, establishing motive and opportunity, gathering evidence, proving guilt. The scientific expertise was essential for understanding how the crime was committed, but the detective framework was essential for understanding why it occurred and who was responsible. The case's resolution brought satisfaction to all parties, except, of course, Maximilian himself. Lord Hartley had answers and knew gardens. Professor Wentworth had advanced scientific understanding of plant death mechanisms and contamination detection. Holmes had solved a seemingly impossible mystery, and justice had been served through Maximilian's conviction and imprisonment. Every case leaves lessons, Holmes told me as we discussed the investigation years later. The Blackthorn case taught that crimes can target beauty and creation as effectively as they target people and property. It taught that scientific knowledge creates both opportunities for progress and tools for destruction. It taught that revenge, however carefully planned, ultimately fails when victims refuse to remain victimized and choose transformation over despair. And it taught that gardens, like human spirits, possess remarkable resilience, the capacity to grow again from barren earth, to create beauty from devastation, to transform catastrophic loss into opportunity for renewal. The garden where nothing grew became a garden where everything grew, not just plants, but understanding, resilience, and new approaches to cultivation and care. Maximilian's intended legacy of permanent barrenness instead became a legacy of transformation and renewal. The poisoned earth that was meant to remain forever dead instead became soil richer and more alive than before the crime. It was, in the end, the perfect defeat of malice through the victim's choice to respond with creation rather than matching the destroyer's bitter sterility. As I concluded my notes on the case years after its resolution, I wrote, "The garden where nothing grew stands as testament to both human capacity for calculated cruelty and human capacity for resilient transformation." Maximilian's crime was sophisticated and devastating, but Lord Hartley's response was more sophisticated still, choosing growth over bitterness, renewal over despair, creation over destruction. The final lesson of the case is not about the criminal who poisoned the earth, but about the gardener who chose to plant again, who transformed tragedy into opportunity, who refused to let malice have the final word. In that choice lies hope, not just for one man's gardens, but for all who face catastrophic loss and must decide whether to remain broken or to build again from barren ground.